Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dan Runde, who is a Senior Vice President, Director of the Project on Prosperity and Development, and holds the William A. Shriver Chair in Global Analysis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, a leading global think tank. He is also the author of The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. Dan Runde, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks for having me. It's a privilege.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Dan, will cover ways that China is integrating itself into the world order and security implications, as well as your book, as I just mentioned, The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. And we will have a link to that in the show notes for people to check it out. But before we get into these topics, Dan, could we start by getting your general assessment of our strategic landscape?
So I wrote the book, The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power, John, because I think that we're in a new age. We're not in the post-Cold War world anymore. Unfortunately, we're in an age of great power competition. And that we're in great power competition with the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. And my view is that this competition is not going to play out in Russia or China. This competition is going to play out in the developing world. It's going to play out in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Island states, in Central Asia, in places like Ukraine and Moldova. That, in short, is largely the developing world. And so most of this competition, God willing, is not going to be a military competition. It's going to be a form of economic competition. It's going to be about vaccines. It's going to be competition in the multilateral system. It's going to be about things like debt. It's going to be things like trade. It's going to be things like infrastructure, or who closes the digital divide, because the digital divide in these developing countries, they're going to get high-speed internet, whether it's going to be their Huawei's internet or somebody else's internet, but they're going to get it. So, and it's also not your grandparents' developing world anymore. It's richer, freer, more capable with options. And if we don't answer the mail on the hopes and aspirations of people in the developing world, they're going to take their business to China and Russia. So we need to understand that this is a very different landscape than 15 years ago or 25 years ago, where you could say, I'm not going to pay my dues in the United Nations, or, I'll give you an example, John. Like during COVID, I was happy to get Pfizer and Moderna, but there was a shortage of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, in the sense that there was enough to go around in the United States. And what we did is, if you've ever been to TGI Fridays, you get one of those buzzers when they say the table's ready. So they went to developing countries and they gave you one of those buzzers saying, look, don't call us. We'll call you in 6 months or 12 months. We'll come to you with the good stuff. We'll come to you with the Pfizer or Moderna, but you're going to have to wait 12 months. So there was a vacuum between 6 and 18 months for developing countries to get the good stuff. We were later able to flood the zone, but there was this 18-month window where we didn't. So if you were a developing country, what would you do? Would you take no vaccine, or would you go with a crappy Chinese or Russian vaccine? And everyone on this podcast has heard of Sinovac, and everyone on this podcast has heard of Sputnik. Well, there's a fancy term in health circles called vaccine diplomacy. The Chinese conducted vaccine diplomacy on triple steroids. They went around and said to places like the Dominican Republic, we've got a plane full of these crappy Sinovac vaccines for you, but we've heard a rumor. You're thinking about recognizing Taiwan instead of the mainland. You wouldn't do something that stupid, would you? Oh, no, we're not going to do that. They also said, we've got this plane full of vaccines. We've also got a wonderful tech company called Huawei. And we think it ought to be part of your digital backbone. Don't you think so? Yes. And so that's what happened. El Salvador, John, recognizes the mainland. Guatemala still thankfully recognizes Taiwan. They share a border. El Salvador got plane loads of crappy vaccines from China. Guatemala got the TGI Fridays treatment, and they were told, hey, wait 12 months. The mainland Chinese Communist Party and the government of El Salvador conducted high-profile, massive vaccine campaigns on the border with Guatemala. It was covered in the Guatemalan press as follows: if only we recognize the mainland, we get the crappy vaccines too. So the point I'm making is that mainland China, people will say on this podcast, I know this is a lot of folks from the national security world will say, what's the soft power stuff? That sounds kind of fuzzy, kind of hippy dippy. Well, guess what? That strikes me as this is a form of soft power that was used in a way to leverage it to get things that mainland China wanted. So they are, in the national security community, they talk a lot about mainland China being a near peer competitor. You've heard that term, John. Well, guess what? They're a near peer soft power competitor too, whether it's vaccines or the multilateral system or technology. And we've got to wake up and smell the coffee. And so I'm saying, I wrote this book, The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power, because this competition is real. It's happening right now. And if you believe that most of this competition is going to play out in the developing world, we're going to need a strategy for the developing world that encompasses non-military forms of our power, and a response that speaks to we need to have a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of our friends in these countries, or they're going to take their business somewhere else.
A while back, we had a discussion with Elham Tabasi from the National Institutes for Standards and Technologies, or NIST. And we'll have a link to this in the show notes for those who want to check out that discussion. But so building off of what you were just talking about, what is your take on the importance of technology standards?
So I think it's really quite important. The United States and the West has been a standard maker, not a standard taker. Now, I'm old enough, and I suspect you are too, John, to remember the VHS standard for video cassette tapes. Mm-hmm. And there was a debate in the late 70s and early 80s about VHS versus beta. And I'm old enough to remember that. And you may be old enough to remember that. What we want is to be able to pick whether it's VHS or beta, that the United States and the West gets to pick VHS or beta. We do not, for commercial reasons and national security reasons. Global standards are really important, and standards have embedded in them in certain ways certain kinds of values. And so oftentimes a lot of the standard making is done in eye-glazingly boring meetings, technical meetings, in multilateral settings. And it's really important that we send enough competent technical people to show up to make sure that we don't get swamped. What mainland China is now able to do is they're able to send dozens of people for months at a time to sit in, dimly lit rooms and bureaucratic meetings that go on and are boring as hell. And they're able to do it, and they've got the stamina for it. We're not sort of set up as a market democracy for these sorts of things. So we're going to have to do a better job sending technical people who've got an iron stomach for sitting for these boring meetings that are really important, so that we don't get rolled in these standard meetings. The other thing, John, is that a lot of these standards are set in weirdly named multilateral organizations. So multilateral organizations of the United Nations system often have money. They often keep lots of important and sensitive information. And the third thing they do is they often set obscure but important standards that are important for trade, for science, for commerce, for the future direction of technology development, all really important things. So my point to you is that standard setting is an important part of great power competition. They've got the scientists. They've got more embassies than the United States has today. And their recent budget called for a 12% increase in diplomacy and a 7% increase in the military. So they value their diplomacy even more than they value their military spending, in the sense that they've increased it more. They're increasing it by 12%. So you need diplomats, and you need people who can sit through eye-glazingly boring meetings, and you need scientists and advocates. They've got that. They're also now seeking to put people in places to run for leadership roles in these institutions. As a shorthand, there are 15 important technical leadership bodies in the United Nations system. At one point, China had 4 of the 15, and they were on their way to a 5th one at 5 of the 15, because we were sort of kind of asleep at the switch. Some of it was a function of, we want China to be, quote unquote, a responsible stakeholder in the international system. But part of it was that, we just weren't paying that much attention. And that one day we woke up and said, oh my goodness, they almost are going to get 5 of the 15 of these technical agencies. So who runs these things matters, because how you set an agenda, who's in the room, who gets hired, all these sorts of things. So leadership jobs, these top UN leadership jobs and these elections really matter, and they have an indirect impact on standard setting. But then we need competent people to show up at these meetings and represent the United States and the West and represent democracy, so that we don't get rolled.
Yeah, 100% on all that. Something I heard, and I didn't validate this. I think it would be difficult to validate, but it's probably directionally accurate, is that China is minting annually something like 1 million PhDs or something like that, and that goes to your point of China can have a manpower advantage, a talent advantage over the rest of the world, and then being able to integrate all of these people into these various different policy and standard setting bodies, and basically just like overwhelm the system with by sheer numbers of people who are either, like you said, willing to sit through the meetings, but not only sit through them, but engage productively and deliberately with intention within these various different standard settings bodies. So that's one comment based off of what you're just saying, Dan. Two, a person that I've been wanting to get onto the podcast, and to our audience, if anybody knows this lady or has a way of making a productive introduction, I would really appreciate it. But one of those bodies that is relatively little known is the International Telecommunication Union, or ITU. It's actually a UN body that is heavily involved in a number of different standards setting projects. Do you have any insights or comments about the ITU, Dan?
I do. I hosted the Doreen Bogdan Martin.
Yes, that's the lady I would love to have.
That's the lady you want to talk to.
Yeah.
So Doreen Bogdan Martin is a special person. The Doreen Bogdan Martin started her career in Washington more than 30 years ago, as she's an engineer by training. And she started at the Department of Commerce. And at some point, she had an opportunity to do a 1-year rotation in Geneva at this thing called the ITU. And this was before the internet. And so this was an opportunity for her to learn about kind of international standard body for cell phones at the time. The ITU has morphed into becoming the Major League Baseball Commission for the internet as well as telecom. It's a really important standard setting technical body of the United Nations system. Well, she learned French. She's very impressive. And she grew up and she was able to, so some forward-looking bureaucrat at the Department of Commerce found the budget, and obviously she was a star and was willing to give up a really strong employee to send to the United Nations representing the United States. Well, the UN was like, this woman's amazing. We ought to hire her. And so she got hired as a full-time staff at the ITU. So she has stayed and grew up in the international system at the ITU. And at some point, there was an opening for the number 3 slot. For the top 3 jobs, you have to run for election. And she went to the American government and said, I'm available. I'd love to run for the number 3 slot. And the American government said, that's a great idea. And so we ran a campaign and got her elected to the number 3 slot at the ITU. This is about 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh, well, there was another election just within the last 6
Correct.
months or so, right?
So I'll get to that. That's right.
Okay.
So she teed herself up. So by getting elected to the number 3 job, she got kind of on the short list to be a candidate for the number 1 job. So the way you run for president of the ITU, that's like an 18-month process. It's like running for president of the United States, John. It's like an 18-month, you got to go through the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucus and the Nevada caucus and the South Carolina primary and Super Tuesday. You get the idea, right?
Kissing babies, all the bit.
Kissing babies and all that stuff, whole bit. So the Biden administration, to their great credit, Tony Blinken, I'm going to say in the first 60 days he was Secretary of State, came out with a press release. You can go find this. I'm going to say it was February 2021, saying there's an election in October of 2022, 18 months from now, more than 18 months from now. Let me be very clear. The United States of America fully supports and endorses the candidacy of Doreen Bogdan-Martin as president of the ITU. It's some other title. It's called Secretary General, okay? But you get the idea, listeners. You had to have foresight. You had to understand there was a calendar. You had to understand there was a real candidate. You had to have a real candidate that was ready to run a campaign. And we had all of that. And then we skipped forward and sent a signal that the United States of America was going to back this American candidate. Well, previously, for 8 years, the number 1 person who had the number 1 job for 8 years before that was from China. I think in retrospect, that person probably won in 2015, probably, or 2014. There was a time, John, where both Republicans and Democrats in Washington and people in the West said, we want to support China's role in the world. Since 1971 until, I'm going to say 2015, there was a concept called that China was a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And we wanted them to have leadership roles in different UN agencies because we thought as they became wealthier, they'd kind of grow up and stop being a teenager, if you will, and they'd, act like a responsible adult in the system. Well, not so much. I think, when they get these jobs, they'd fill it too often with too many Chinese Communist Party members. There were weird behaviors with contracts being won, and Taiwan would get kicked out as soon as they came in. They'd kick Taiwan out. So there were a series of kind of things where you couldn't really trust them with the car keys anymore with these things. So it was very important that Doreen Bogdan-Martin won this election. And I think it was a sign that we were now going to kind of mind the store a little bit more in terms of these elections. We did a whole report here at CSIS about American leadership in the multilateral system. I want your listeners to understand that, 25 years ago, we would talk about I'm not going to pay my dues in the UN. I'm quitting the UN. Well, 25 years ago, you could have a temper tantrum like that and we could get away with it. Today, China would say, that's great. If the United States isn't going to pay their dues, I'll pay America's dues. I want your listeners to think about what kind of chumps we'd look like if Red China went around paying our dues in the multilateral system because we're throwing some kind of temper tantrum because we don't like the UN system or we don't like this or that about the UN system. We can't afford to play that kind of a game and operate like we're some kind of unhappy, 4-year-old. And we can't afford to say, I'm going to slam the door and leave. When we attempted to quit the WHO, guess what? Nobody followed us out the door. And I was worried China was going to say, I'll pay America's dues in the WHO. Very dangerous. So the point is, we need leaders we need 1,000 people like Doreen Bogdan-Martin who will grow up in the multilateral system and who can stand for, can step forward and lead with integrity, and somebody who's imbued with democratic values and in a sense of the goodness of America. They're not obviously American citizens. They're American citizens who are taking on international responsibility roles. And they're going to act with responsibility, and they're going to operate with the dignity that's required for the high office in the international system.
Yeah, so I guess I wanted to ask you, Dan, if you could maybe illuminate a couple of other ways that China has been integrating themselves into the world order that people just may not be familiar with.
Yeah, I think I think Americans, even sophisticated folks listening to your podcast, may not understand the importance of the UN system and the multilateral system. There's something like 200 multilateral organizations. The United States recognizes at least 130 of them as organizations where the diplomats have what is called diplomatic immunity, where they've got some kind of, we've got in essence a real relationship with them, if I'll put it that way. And these organizations, as I mentioned earlier, have a lot of money. They've got a lot of influence in other parts of the world, even if we don't pay attention to them. The developing world pays a lot of attention to them. They have a lot of moral authority in the developing world. And then they also are standard setting bodies. So who runs these organizations really matters. So let me give you a couple of examples. So about 5 years ago, there's, as I said, there's about 200. I'd say, John, there's about 30 that are really, really important. I call them the commanding heights of the multilateral system. These are things like the IMF and the World Bank. And I'd say the ITU is probably in that category as well, frankly. We talked a little bit about the ITU earlier. But I'm going to say 5 years ago, an organization that it's not in the top 30, but is an important enough organization, is called the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO. And the United States, so China put forward the resume candidate to run the FAO. So first of all, what is the FAO? If you put a gun to my head, I had to kind of do a little bit of homework to figure out what exactly is the FAO, John. Well, this is how I understand it. If I'm holding up a red piece of fruit, is that a raspberry or a strawberry? And how do we know? Well, they're like the classifier of what counts as a raspberry and what counts as a strawberry. That sounds stupid, maybe, but if it's a raspberry, then that means it gets access to certain kinds of money from research institutes that are specialized just in raspberries. There's like specialized funds for potatoes and specialized funds for wheat and specialized funds for rice. The other thing is, for global trade, they have classifications like, well, if it's a strawberry, it gets this kind of a tariff, and it's a raspberry, it gets that kind of a tariff, right? So it matters for trade, and it matters for scientific research. It would also imagine, let's say you have a big red, juicy grape with no seeds in it. Well, maybe you kind of genetically modified it, or you had some kind of there's some special genetic map of the red, juicy grape without seeds. They've got a file with the DNA map of the red, juicy grape without seeds, saying that's the red, juicy grape without seeds, if you see what I'm saying. And they've got a file with all that. That's probably pretty valuable intellectual property. The other thing they've got is, let's say Madagascar is divided up into 10 counties. Well, they've got a map somewhere in the FAO that says, okay, East Overshoe County is the county in Madagascar with the most productive soil. So if you wanted to do, let's say, a land grab in Africa, where you've heard about China doing land grabs in Africa, well, wouldn't that be useful to have a map of the most productive soil in Africa so you could do better land grabs? So you can imagine quickly that having a file with the red, juicy grape without the seeds and a map of East Overshoe Madagascar is pretty darn interesting and important, right? Yeah, but it takes 5 minutes to explain to your listeners what the heck is the FAO, or otherwise, like, who cares? It's useless, right? Well, it's not so useless. It's got a repository of potentially really valuable and interesting stuff. So there's an election. You got to run for election. So guess what? China puts forward a guy who's a member of the Chinese Communist Party, speaks perfect English, speaks perfect French, because French matters in these organizations, has some PhD from somewhere impressive in the West, has grown up as some kind of an agronomist or something legit that would work for the FAO. And they put him forward. Guess what? As I said earlier, John, China has more embassies today than the United States of America. And you use embassies to run campaigns like the one I'm describing here. And the US and Europe were divided over what candidate to put forward. So the French put forward one candidate and America put forward another candidate. There was also, I think, I'm a Republican, and there's some Republicans who think the United Nations is worthless. And so sometimes people don't pay attention or don't care or think it's useless. Well, guess what? The resume candidate from China got 120 votes. How many votes did the American candidate get? 12. Got our teeth kicked in. This is a family podcast, so I'm going to just say we got our teeth kicked in, okay? But really bad. It was a humiliation and a wake-up call that they could field candidates, they could run campaigns and run diplomatic démarches, or whatever the technical term for basically going and talking to your colleagues in another country, and they could do it. And they beat us really badly.
This is just one organization.
This is just one organization. So this happened during the Trump administration. They said, oh my gosh, maybe they're not so useless after all. Maybe this doesn't feel so good that we had our teeth kicked in. So I got a phone call from a friend of mine who became the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations agencies in Geneva. This is in November of 2019. He says, I just got confirmed by the Senate to represent the United States in front of about 10 agencies in Geneva. It's an important job. And he said, my most important job is going to be to prevent China from winning an election for something called WIPO. Now, John, I had no idea what WIPO was. Now, some of your listeners are more switched on perhaps than I am about this. Maybe they're in the legal profession. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're in the tech world. But WIPO is the Major League Baseball Commission for Intellectual Property. So if John Bicknell and I design a new ballpoint pen, so 30 years ago, John Bicknell and I would have drawn up a blueprint. And we have put the blueprint in an envelope. And we'd have sent the blueprint in the envelope to the Patent and Trade Office in Arlington, Virginia. Somebody with a green eye shade would have opened up the envelope and then taken the blueprint and gone to a paper filing cabinet and went and looked in the paper filing cabinet to see if the blueprint that John and I had for this ballpoint pen was unique and different. Then they would photocopy they would Xerox copy the blueprint, put it in an envelope, send it in the airmail to Geneva, Switzerland, where there was a gigantic filing cabinet. And there were photocopies of everybody's blueprints in the whole wide world, from Denmark and Austria and Australia, to make sure that John and Dan hadn't copied somebody else's blueprint. And then they could say, yep, this is really, truly unique. And that's called the World Intellectual Property Organization. Well, fast forward, John, 30 years. It's email. It's a CAD drawing or a PDF. You send it over the mail over some special cable link, maybe provided by a telecom company. And then guess what? There's not a filing cabinet. There's a giant cloud file with everybody's intellectual property in the whole wide world. You could quickly understand this might be a little complicated. So guess what happens again? 6 months after we had our teeth kicked in with the FAO, the Trump administration said that didn't feel very nice. And this actually seems like a slightly higher stakes exercise with this WIPO thing. So they said, will you help us with this? Help us run a campaign to stop China from winning this election. I said, heck yeah, I'll help you. And I said, is there a WIPO for dummies? And you go on Google, John, there's only technocratic gobbledygook to explain what the hell is WIPO. For smart, educated listeners like your listeners, there was nothing that was accessible to normal people. So a young person from my team and I spent a week going back and forth, putting together a WIPO for dummies. What the hell is WIPO? What does it do? Who's on the election committee? How do the votes work? Is it a 1-for-1 vote? Who are the 10 candidates? And what are the stakes? Then we convened 2 meetings of the White House, and industry, and other interested parties to say anybody but ABC, anybody but China, who's our candidate going to be? So we had a meeting in December of 2019 and January of 2018. And we helped crystallize a consensus around an alternate candidate other than China. And once a year now, going forward, John, given that there's 200 of these organizations, and let's say there are 30 important ones, once a year, there's going to be an important election. Last year was ITU. This year, I'm not quite sure which one it's going to be, but so for example, there's an election every cycle. There's 5 or 6 of these at any one time. My point is, this isn't 1995 anymore. We can't just sort of like rest on our laurels. They're putting really good candidates.
Right, or appoint people or put forth candidates to these kinds of positions because of like a political favor or something like
right,
that.
Or something like a chucklehead. You can't put forward an idiot for these things. Because they're putting forward world-class, really good resume candidates. So you can't fight something with nothing. So we got to have really high caliber, excellent candidates.
Is there, that you're aware of, Dan, a government agency that has the belly button on this dynamic?
Okay, that's a good question. So I'd say much of this, 80% of this, 70% of this, is kind of monitored by the Bureau for International Organizations at the State Department. It's called IO. So there's an assistant secretary, and part of their job is to watch this. And then there's also people in some of the specialized representations that we have. So in New York, the U.S. representation in New York, or the U.S. representation in Geneva, and somewhat the U.S. representation in Rome. We've got people who kind of keep an eye on this, or should be, if that's part of their job. We also have representatives and some of the ambassadors that we have at some of these specialized agencies. We have ambassadors at some of these specialized agencies. And so it's important that we put forward excellent people. And part of the job is just to mind the store and just make sure that, they're not pulling a fast one on us.
Mm-hmm. Right. You mentioned this way back up at the top. You mentioned the Department of Commerce. Do you see the Department of Commerce playing any kind of a role in this general discussion space?
So the Department of Commerce oversees some of the agencies that we've talked about, including
like NIST. NIST is under the Department of, okay.
Right. Yeah. So there are things like certain oceanic functions, certain telecoms functions, certain export control functions are related to the Commerce Department.
Quite frankly, rather overwhelming. I'm happy to know that there are people like you, Dan, who are thinking and engaging and bringing this to people's awareness, and that some government agencies are also sitting up and taking notice as well. Obviously, a very important project to stay on top of. I'd like to go into a lightning round. So 30 seconds to 1 minute per response, and then we'll close it out, Dan. So first lightning round, Africa.
There's 1 billion people in Africa. 25 years from now, John, there'll be 2 billion people in Africa. There'll be more Africans than citizens of India and mainland China combined 25 years from now. It's going to be much more important than it is today. And we have been a good partner to Africa, but we need an economic partnership with Africa. And we are about 15 years behind where we need to be in terms of thinking about having an economic partnership with Africa.
Just to tag onto that, would you say that China has a lead on Africa relations?
China sees Africa as a win-win opportunity. It does not see Africa as a continent, as a development partner. It sees Africa as an economic business partner. China's had long-standing ties with Africa for at least 60 years and warm relations with many countries. There are some East African countries that have had ties to Africa going back hundreds of years through trading. That's a little understood or little appreciated. So mainland China is the number of, there are 54 African countries. And I'm going to guess in at least 30 of those countries, John, mainland China is the #1 trading partner. That's different than 20 years ago.
Next lightning round, batteries.
If we're going to have a carbon transition, you better love mining and minerals processing to the tips of your toes. And so most of the conversation I've seen about global climate change does not have mining and minerals priced into the discussion. And right now, mainland China controls 40% of all metals processing because it's dirty and there's a lot of NIMBY issues. We're going to have to mine 40 times the amount of cobalt and lithium that we're currently mining to have all those electric vehicle batteries. So you better love mining and minerals, and there's going to be a lot of complicated human rights trade-offs and environmental trade-offs and community trade-offs and native peoples trade-offs and metals processing trade-offs. I have a very hard time imagining the United States of America is going to trade out Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela on oil and gas for the People's Republic of China on electric vehicle batteries. I have a very hard time believing that. So if that's the case, we're going to need to have a strategy, and we're going to have to start working on it right now. So if you're concerned about climate change and you're talking about metals and mining and electric vehicle batteries in that context, it's basically a baloney conversation.
Next lightning round, the 21st century space race.
You know, I don't have a great take on this topic. I think that I do know that they are much further ahead than I think we give them credit. I think we basically kind of took a time out after the Challenger disaster in the 80s. And I think we've had kind of a conflicted relationship with the private sector in space. And mainland China has there's been a void in the space. And so mainland China, like other things, has been filling that void.
Right. Yeah. My take on the space race is also related to technology standards and infusing values into the technology stack. The space race, I think, is a major component of that, and so there's key terrain in space, if you will, like the moon itself, but you've got the Lagrange points in space, which are very important geographies around the Earth and Moon system. So if China is the first to establish infrastructure in these areas of space, then they're going to be setting the standards, and those standards, I think, can then, in some kind of a way that I can't directly map, but those standards, I would think, could somehow feed back into standards which are terrestrial. And so, anyway, I think that there's a touch point there with technology standards and value setting with space. Well, this has been awesome, Dan. Last question. So we have a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer something that a interested student might investigate further to help advance our knowledge in this space?
So I would encourage everybody to go read Invisible China by Rozelle. And it's a book about China's lack of investment in human capital in mainland China, and that it's ultimately going to be one of the seeds of its inability to surpass the United States. Scott Rozelle is a labor economist at Stanford University, Rozelle. I want everyone, of course, to read The American Imperative by me, which I just published, but I'd say one of the most interesting books I've read in the last 5 years is Invisible China by Scott Rozelle, Rozelle, talking about the fact that mainland China may be stuck in its middle-income country development because of its failure to fully invest in human capital in its people when they had the chance.
So does this argument by Rozelle also unpack China's demographic challenges?
Yes, it's in the context of a demographic dividend that they've now kind of maxed out they've now done their demographic window for growth is closing because they're now in a period of aging. And so they're gonna start hitting limits to their ability to grow based on the number of people that they have. And so they're really gonna have to depend on human productivity gains. And that depends on education and capacity building. And the problem is they haven't invested in some of the basic building blocks of education and capacity building that you need for that kind of productivity growth. So it's a complex but really important argument. And I encourage everyone to go read this book because the bottom line means is that they're going to hit there's going to be a ceiling to their growth, which means they're not going to be able to surpass us in terms of economic growth over time. And in fact, with their demography shrinking, if we play our cards right, they're going to have the demographic heft of Portugal, and they'll be a big economy, but they'll be it's going to be hard for them to surpass us, and that's good for us in the long run.
Great suggestion there, Dan. And also, we had another episode with a gentleman named Nick Eberstadt, which focused on demographic challenges, not just with China, but with other areas of the country, including the United States. So definitely a big topic that's worth understanding better and studying more, as you suggested, Dan. And with that, Dan Runde, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you. Thanks so much, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.